Oh, it comes in spurts. All right, last call. Going once, going twice. All right. Okie doke, let's see. Here we are. So we're doing okay with our understanding of predicting how many bonds an element will form. Why don't we recap neon? Let's go back. I'm going to use this because it's already illustrated out. So if we take a look, I want to remind you, oops, where are you going? The wrong way. Look at this. I told you the story of how I used to make fun of my mom for being like completely untech savvy. So when I was a kid, right, we got this fancy new thing called a VCR. You guys know what a VCR is? I don't even know if you guys know.
My.
They were brand new, right? And my mom, for the life of her, she could not figure out how to use a VCR. And I was like, come on, Mom, it's not that hard. And now I'm like, compassion for my mother because I'm like, Zoom, it's really not that hard. I don't know why I keep making mistakes. We all turn into our parents eventually, it seems. All right, so we're going to take a look at the periodic table, right? Here's neon, right? Remember, we're looking for this number at the top. What is that number at the top? What do we call it? What's the term? What does this represent, that number at the top?
The atomic number?
Atomic number.
Atomic number, awesome. So atomic number of 10. I know some of you guys got this, but remember it's first time chemistry for some folks. So it's kind of hard to grasp initially. So our atomic number 10 means we have 10 protons. We have that means we also have 10 electrons, right? So when we distribute electrons, we're going to allocate them to orbitals. And remember that each of those orbitals or shells are going to contain a specific number of electrons. Your first orbital, your innermost orbital, is always going to be the s orbital, right? The s orbital holds 2 electrons. You fill it first, right? So of those 10 electrons that neon has, we're going to put 2 in the first s orbital. Right? That's going to leave 8 electrons, right, that are going to go in the next orbital out, the p orbital. How many electrons fit in the p orbital?
8 electrons.
8 electrons. And if you put 8 electrons in, there's no empty seats. Right? Neon is stable. Right? And if it's stable, is it going to want to form bonds?
No.
Lifelong bachelor, right? Neon. Not going to want to form bonds. Make sense? So again, I'm going to put together a little chemistry homework for next week. I was going to give you a little bit of a vote. Ooh, I'll add it in a poll later. So I'm going to tell you right now, and then I'll ask you again at the end once you've had a chance to think about it. So I still have to do the video on the slides from the first introduction on the patterns of science. So I'm going to put that together for sure this weekend as one of your homework assignments, and then have a few questions associated with that. So that'll be on Canvas. So I was kind of feeling bad about also doing chemistry homework, but here's how I'm going to propose it to you. I can either give you 2 homework assignments, the watching the video, answering some questions, and then answering some chemistry questions as a second assignment, or I can just throw it into a quiz. So you think late about it. Would you rather have it as a homework assignment or as a quiz? I don't know. It's all the same to me, but I'll let you guys have a voice in that. All right. So we said that chemical elements are sometimes, any questions before I move on? No, you guys are good. All right. So we said that chemical elements are going to form bonds according to how many empty seats they have in their valence electron shell, right? They want to fill it up so that they're stable. When they form a bond, they're going to be transferring or sharing electrons to help fill those empty seats, right? So chemical elements that are reactive, right, want to form chemical bonds to gain stability. Right? In our body, right, these I call them lonely elements or molecules that have open valence seats are going to want to form bonds, and they're going to be looking, right, for something to form a bond with. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll disrupt or bind with your cell wall or a protein or your DNA. And in the process of forming that bond, it damages the cell or the molecule that it's binding with, right? So free radicals, reactive elements or molecules or ions, right, can cause damage to your body, right, by binding with them. So in our bodies, we utilize something called an antioxidant, right? So how many of you guys heard of antioxidants before, right? They've been really popular in the last, 5 years, right? Buy our granola bars, it's chock full of antioxidants, right? Buy our palm juice, it's chock full of antioxidants, and you need antioxidants. They help you to bind to free radicals. It's healthy, right? And so here's the cool thing about humans, right? Some point along the primate lineage, right, we used to be able to make our own antioxidants in our body. We had an enzyme that helped us to produce them. There was a mutation, and that enzyme no longer functioned. So in the primate lineage, we are no longer able to synthesize our own antioxidants, right? So we have to consume them in our diet, right? And a well-balanced diet is going to get you sufficient antioxidants to deal with free radicals in your body. Right? Since we can't make it and we have to consume it, and we don't always eat, right, well-balanced diets with fruits and vegetables, right, where you would get some of those antioxidants, food companies are now supplementing, right, with antioxidants as a way to sell healthy products because we're into healthy food, right? Your dog, your cat, do you ever need to buy them antioxidant supplements? No, they're fine, right? It turns out they can make their own antioxidants, right? So all the fancy schmancy, and not to say that I don't buy my dog fancy schmancy food, because I do, but when it has like blueberries, because it's got antioxidants, it always makes me giggle, because I'm like, well, the dog doesn't need antioxidants. He's making his own antioxidants. But in any case, so we have to consume them in our diet, right? Because what the antioxidants do is bind with the free radicals and essentially neutralize them so that they don't bind and damage your cells, your DNA, your proteins, molecules in your body. Right? What kind of foods can we consume to get antioxidants? So we usually know about blueberries and cherries, right, are high in antioxidants. Vitamin E can act as an antioxidant, right? So when you're eating nuts or fish, beta carotene can also act as an antioxidant. So if you're eating a well-balanced diet, you're getting sufficient antioxidants. You don't need to go out and buy 10 products and be supplementing antioxidants every meal of the day. Sometimes people go a little bit overboard, right? And so what we're seeing now is, after this big marketing push with all these products that have antioxidants, that people are starting to see ill effects from it, right? Because you're getting too many antioxidants in your body. It's binding to all the free radicals. And turns out you need free radicals in your body. They have a function. How do you kill a cell? Why would you want to kill a cell? Let me ask you that instead. Why would you want to kill a cell in your body? Why would you want free radicals in your body to be able to kill cells?
If you have cancer cells, you want to have them attack those cells.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you want to kill cells, right? It's like, this message will self-destruct. If this cell is infected with a virus or precancerous, you might be using something like a free radical to help you kill that cell. So when you bind all your free radicals to antioxidants because you're pounding them in every snack that you're eating across over the course of the day, right? You no longer have that capacity to utilize the free radicals that you need sometimes. Does this make sense? Everything in moderation. Well-balanced diet, right? Well, maybe not fun in moderation, but a well-balanced diet will get you everything that you need. You shouldn't be needing supplements if you're eating healthy. All right, good. Any questions, antioxidants?
No.
Fun chemistry application. All right, so chemical bonds are what we're going to talk about next, right? And again, this is where we're going to give it the good old baby biology coverage of chemical bonds. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about how we view chemical bonds in biological context. So a chemical bond is going to be an interaction between the electrons of two or more atoms. It could be two of the same atoms. It could be different atoms. It could be 5 atoms. It could be 1,000 atoms, right? That are well, maybe not 1,000, but it could be multiple atoms that are forming a chemical bond. And I'll show you some pictures in just a bit. So again, the reactivity of the chemical elements involved in a bond or their propensity to form a chemical bond is going to be driven by those valence electrons, right? Do they have empty seats in order to fill to gain stability? So we're going to talk a little bit about the types of chemical bonds, and I'm going to give you some examples, and then we'll talk about these concepts a little bit more as we go through and start learning about the major biological molecules. So, and I'm going to remind you, right, that sometimes when you form a chemical reaction between different elements, it can change their state of matter, right? And I'll recap that as we go through. So here are the 3 types of bonds that we're going to discuss, right? Ionic bonds, where you see a transfer of electrons. Covalent bonds are going to be when you're sharing an electron, and what that means is that the electron spends part of its time in one orbital and with one element and part in the other, right? So they're sharing it. And then I'm going to talk about hydrogen bonds, which we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about hydrogen bonds because they're fundamental for the properties of water. So let's start off with ionic bonds first, right? So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how ions form before we talk about an ionic bond that forms between 2 ions. So we're going to take a look at sodium here, and let me go back to the periodic table really quick. Oh, I should have put a poll in. All right. So how many bonds will sodium form? How many bonds does sodium need to form to gain stability?
Is it 7?
Yeah, it's 7, right? So good job. Let's take a look. So if we look at the picture, right? Sodium had an atomic number of 11, right? So 2 electrons in the first orbital, the s orbital. 8 electrons get placed in the first p orbital. It's full. Still has 1 more electron, so you add another p orbital. It's a valence shell, right? There's the 1 electron. What do you think? 7 bonds? Is that reasonable to form? Not reasonable. And how could 1 little sodium atom fit 7 bonds around it? Right? So what sodium's going to do, instead of trying to form 7 bonds to gain stability, it's going to have a propensity to lose its electron. I'm just going to dump it into the environment, right? Because if sodium dumps its electron into the environment, now it's left with a full valence shell and it gains stability. Yeah? But if I lose 1 negative charge, what happens to my overall charge of that atom?
It becomes positive.
It becomes positive because now you have more protons than electrons. Make sense? A positively charged ion is called a cation. And so, I don't know, I once had a student tell me that, oh, when you pet your cat, it's a positive experience, right? So that might help you to remember that cat ions are positively charged. But maybe that only works if you like cats, right? So if that doesn't work for you, come up with your own little story, right? So if we take a look at chlorine here, right? Chlorine, if I'm going to just skip to, let's take a look at its distribution of electrons. Notice how it has one empty seat, right? It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons in its outer valence shell. Now it can form a bond, but it's also very likely to just pick up an electron from the environment, right? Because there's going to be electrons out in the environment, especially if you're in a watery solution, that you can readily pick up because there's going to be other cations forming out there, right? So chlorine will pick up an electron, and if it picks up an extra electron, it now has 1 electron more than protons. What's going to happen to its charge? It's going to get negative. It's going to become an anion, right? So an anion has a negative charge. It is an atom that has picked up an extra electron. What happens if I pick up 2 electrons? Then I'll have a 2 negative.
Negative by 2?
Yes, negative
Or-
by 2.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? So ions are atoms that have either picked up electrons or lost electrons, right? And then they're going to end up having an overall charge, right? So now what's going to happen in an ionic bond? It's a type of bond that's going to form between 2 ions, a cation and an anion. So the positive charge of one and the negative charge of another is going to lead to electrostatic attraction. I'm going to hold them together. So for example, sodium chloride, right? The sodium and the chloride are going to be attracted to each other because they have opposite charge. Now, in chemistry class, your chemistry teacher will tell you ionic bonds are the strongest, right? But from a biological context, right, ionic bonds in aqueous solutions in water readily break apart. They're readily disrupted, right? And in biological systems, living organisms, 70% or more water. Right? Water inside of our cells, water outside of our cells, water in our digestive tracts, water in our blood vessels. Right? So in a biological context, in solution inside of the body of an organism, ionic bonds aren't the strongest. Does that make sense? So I just want to make sure we're really, really clear on that, because your chemistry teacher is going to tell you ionic bonds are the strongest. In biology, we always go, no, not in aqueous solutions, not in the context of a body. Does that make sense? So for our purposes, ionic bonds are not the strongest. All right. So covalent bonds are what a biologist will call the strongest bond, right? And covalent bonds are a bond that forms between 2 elements, could be the same element or 2 different elements or multiple elements that are sharing electrons. And again, that means that the electron spending part of the time in the orbital one and part in the orbital of the other. They're sharing it. Right? If you have 1 empty valency, maybe you're going to share 1 electron. That's a single covalent bond, right? So single covalent bonds in a biological context are stronger, right, than ionic bonds. Right? I always joke that ionic bonds are like, casual dating. Come together, break, come together, break, right? Whereas, single covalent bonds, now you're, have a joint checking account. Right? You're kind of a little bit more attached to each other, harder to break apart. You're going to lose something if you break apart. Right? You can share 2 electrons, right? Now you have 2 electrons shared between you guys, right? Pretty strong, stronger than a single covalent bond. That's like your dating elements now got married, right? Harder to break. And then you've got the big beefy triple bond, right? That's like, now you have kids, right? You're sharing 3 electrons, and it's really hard to break. So I think we talked about the example of nitrogen. where nitrogen forms 3 bonds. It forms 3 covalent bonds with another nitrogen atom, N2. That nitrogen, really hard to break apart, atmospheric nitrogen, because of that triple bond. Good? Covalent bonds?
Good.
Okay. So now here's the quirky thing about covalent bonds. I'm going to tell you, have you ever, like, you go to dinner and sometimes you're like, oh, can't have a full dessert, let's share a dessert. And sometimes you have friends that will, oh, really good chocolate cake, or I don't know what you've ordered that's like your favorite thing. It's really delicious, right? And, you have some friends that will equally share the cake and you guys both get equal number of bites, right? Very equitable. And then sometimes you have the friend that sneakily takes extra, right, bites, and you don't get your fair share of the cake. You guys know what I'm talking about? This is my friend Karen Kelly. All right.
Yes.
How does this relate to bonds, right? So the person who hogs the cake, right, is kind of like in a chemical bond, the element that's more electronegative. Right? Electronegativity is this propensity for one atom to have a stronger attraction to the electron and kind of hog it. Takes more bites of cake. So in a covalent bond, the more electronegative element, the electron's going to be spending more time there. Right? And I'm not going to get too much into, the whys of electronegativity. I just want you to understand it, basic concept. And I want you to remember that oxygen is very electronegative. Right? It's an electron hog. Right? And so what happens, right? So if we take a look at this figure, here's the oxygen, right? And here are the 2 hydrogen, right? That oxygen is forming a bond with, right? This water molecule here. Right? Now, oxygen is way more electronegative than the hydrogen. And so it's going to hog the electrons, right? So if I imagine that these electrons are in orbit, right? Check out my cursor. I'm going to imagine that my electrons are spending all this time with oxygen's orbit, and then they come to hydrogen, and then back all this time with oxygen, and then they go to hydrogen, and then all this time with oxygen, and then just a little bit of time with the hydrogen, right? And because those electrons are more likely over here at any given point in time, they're going to be bringing their charge over here to the slight charge to the oxygen side. So the oxygen side, because it's kind of hogging the electrons, it's going to end up with a slight negative charge. Not a full-blown charge. It didn't steal the electrons completely. It's just hogging them. The hydrogen, on the other hand, because its electrons mostly over here, is going to end up with a slight positive, right, for both of them. So we end up with a molecule that's got a slight charged aspect to it. Right? Does this make sense? We call this polarity. Right? So that's what we're going to talk about next. Right? So covalent bonds, we're talking about covalent bonds, can equally share electrons or unequally share electrons, depending on the type of covalent bond you're looking at. What are the elements in there? Sometimes there isn't a stark electronegativity difference between the 2 elements, and you have what's called a nonpolar covalent bond. The 2 elements in your bond, or the 3 elements in your bond, are sharing the electron equally. And because it's even-steven, right, spending equal time in both elements, there is no slight charge, nonpolar, right? Polar covalent bonds results anytime there's unequal sharing. One element in that reaction is more electronegative than the others. So in the case of oxygen in water, right? So oxygen has really strong electronegativity properties, and that's going to be really important for biological systems. It's why we need oxygen to stay alive, because we're going to use oxygen and its electronegative properties to help us cycle energy in our cells. So we're going to come back and talk about oxygen quite a bit, right? So just remember, it's very electronegative. it's going to cause water molecules to be polar. Does that make sense? Slight negative charge on one end, slight positive charge on another. All right. So now this means that you have slight charge atoms next to each other. So what we're going to do is next talked about the interaction between those two potentially polar molecules, right? So when you have a slight charge, you're going to be attracted, right? The slight negative end of one water molecule is going to be attracted, right, to the slight positive end of a neighboring water molecule, and they're going to come together and form what's called a hydrogen bond. Right? The hydrogen bond, though, right, is just an attraction between a slight charge. So it's not very strong individually. It's going to form and break, form and break, form and break, like you see in the GIF. Does that make sense? Hydrogen bonds. Right. So hydrogen bonds form between polar molecules or charged molecules. Right. So on the top image here, you're looking at a water molecule. Notice how the red is the oxygen and the two little blue bubbles are the hydrogen. And you're looking at an ammonia molecule. That ammonia molecule is also polar, right? So you're seeing a hydrogen bond can form between two different molecules. Does this make sense? Hydrogen bonds?
Yeah, I have a question, Professor.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is the hydrogen bonds, those can only form if there's the electronegativity, because that's like when there's one side is really positive.
Mm-hmm. Slightly positive.
Okay, so it doesn't happen unless one side is more positive than the other side.
I don't know that that statement is 100% accurate.
Okay.
So let's break it back down to the electronegativity, right? Remember that electronegativity means the elements in the bond are not sharing the electron equally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that part makes sense.
Okay. So it's going to end up giving a slight charge. Remember, a full charge would come from if the oxygen completely took the electron out into its bond and didn't share it anymore. So it's just a slight charge because the electron is spending more of its time on the oxygen side of the molecule.
Okay.
And that slight charge, that slight negative charge on the oxygen side of the molecule is going to be attracted to anything that's got a positive charge.
Okay.
So that could be another polar molecule. It could be a charged surface. It could be an ion. It's going to be attracted to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
And form hydrogen bonds. Great. It's great when you guys ask questions because remember, if you're confused, it's likely a handful of other people in the class are confused as well. And remember the Zoom thing, like I can only see like 5 faces. And so it's hard for me to gauge how you guys are doing because you're not giving me the, the head tilt of, I don't understand. So it's hard for me to gauge how you guys are doing out there. Okay, so chemical reactions, right? We just talked about 3 types of bonds that form, right? Ionic, hydrogen, covalent. The forming and breaking of bonds we refer to as a chemical reaction, right? Molecules or atoms that are stable, right, are bounded to each other are going to come together, break the existing bonds, and reassemble into new patterns of organization, right? So when we take a look at chemical reactions, we're just going to talk about this image down here, right? We're going to have atoms that go in to our reaction, ingredients, if you would, right? And then we're going to reassemble them into what are called products, right? So the ingredients that you're adding into a chemical reaction are called the reactants. These are great terms, right? They're really intuitive. The reactants are going to be reacting. So they're your starting material. The products are going to be what gets produced by the chemical reaction, right? Now, remember what we talked about, the law of conservation of matter. Matter's not created, matter's not destroyed. So if we take a look, right, so here's the chemical equation, the 2H2 and the O2 being converted into two water molecules. Notice that the H2, right, refers to two hydrogen bound to each other, stable, right? Two hydrogen bound to each other, stable, right? There's two of them. Right? And then you have an O2 molecule, which is two oxygen bound to each other. Right? So if we count, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogen that went into our reaction, and notice how many hydrogen came out. 4. We had 2 oxygen go into our reaction, 2 come out. Law of conservation of matter. What goes in comes out. All that's happening is that you're breaking the existing bonds, and then the atoms kind of move again and form new bonds in order to regain that stability. Now, what do you think? Do you think these stable gases here want to break their bonds? They've gained stability. They're happily married there, right? They don't want to break apart. That's going to require energy. This is why we need energy in our body to break bonds that are already in existence. Right? So we're also going to be learning next week about enzymes, right? And enzymes are going to help us to motivate those bonds to break. So there's usually energy involved in a chemical reaction, and then a series of steps, right? The magic arrow, right, indicates that something happened to break those bonds and reassemble them. Also notice how in this case, my 2 gases, right, when they reacted, turned into liquid water. Yeah, we can change the state of matter when we form a chemical bond. Does this make sense, chemical reactions terminology? Yeah. Okay. All right. So chemical reactions are fundamental to life, right? This is what keeps us alive, are the chemical reactions that are happening, the complex chemical reactions that are happening in our bodies. So we call these metabolic pathways, right? When you're talking about your metabolism, you're talking about your rate of chemical reactions that are happening in your body, right? So we're going to be in a couple weeks talking about 2 big important chemical reactions, cellular respiration and this reaction that you're seeing here, photosynthesis, right? So again, law of conservation of matter, what you put in just gets broken apart and reassembled, right? And usually takes some form of energy. I will remind you, right, that in biology, we kind of think about chemical bonds as a way to store energy. And when we break them, we release energy that we can then convert into a different type of energy. So chemical reactions, super important, right? Running them all the time, right? All right. Next set of definitions, we're going to talk about solutions, solvents, and solutes, right? So a solution is a mixture, right? Is defined as a mixture between a solvent and a solute, right? So it's a liquid that contains something that's been dissolved in it, in essence, right? So if we're taking a look at our Gatorade here in the images, the Gatorade itself is a solution. It's made up of the solute, right? The thing that's usually being dissolved. I always think about it as the thing that you put in to the liquid, right? The solvent is generally the dissolving agent, right? Generally a liquid for our purposes. Right? And when you mix them and they're homogeneous, remember, means equal distribution, right? It's been dissolved. If you're talking about Gatorade, or if you're talking about milk, it's been emulsified, right? So we have homogenized milk. Milk where it's been emulsified so the cream fatty layer doesn't rise to the top. All right, make sense? So if I were making chocolate milk, my Hershey's powder would be which?
The solvent. The solute, sorry.
The solute, yeah. Did I tell you my story about the cleaning product? Most powerful solvent on earth? I did tell you that already. Yeah, you know that already. Okay. All right. Last concept in this lecture. Any questions? Solutes, solvents, solutions? You guys good? Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is pH, right? And I think pH is important to understand. I think that there's so many things that people don't understand these days. How many of you guys seen that video of of the lady, and she's testing the pH of all the water bottles. You guys seen this video out there?
Yeah.
Drives me crazy. Okay. So I used to like maybe breeze I always second guess myself. I'm like, is it important to spend this much time talking about pH? And then I see shit like that on the internet. I'm like, yes, it's really important to talk about this in class. So we're going to spend some time talking about pH and what does it mean, right? Okay. So if we take a look at a pH scale, like we're looking at here, notice how the pH scale runs from 0 to 14. It's kind of an oddball, right? Because neutral pH is in the middle, right? Which is atypical for how we scale things, right? So neutral pH is at a 7, right? And that would be something like pure water. Water molecules and nothing else in there. And if we take a look at pure water, I forgot to talk about water dissociation. So remember we said that in a water molecule, the oxygen is hogging the electron. And sometimes it hogs the electron so hard that it's the hydrogen is like, I'm out, right? I'm breaking up with you. And it pops off. Right? And it's like it leaves its dog behind. I'm so desperate to get out of here, I'm going to leave the dog behind. It leaves the electron. So the OH part of the water molecule keeps the electron, it has a negative charge. It now becomes an anion. The hydrogen that's left and left behind its electron now becomes a cation. It's got a positive charge. So in any body of water, at any given time, you've got a bunch of H2Os, and then you have a bunch that are broken up also, dissociated. Right? And they break up and they get back together, and they break up and they get back together, and they break up and they get back together. Right? Yes, we all have friends like that, right? Break up, come back, break up, come back. Right? So in pure water, notice how you have about equal OH to H plus. It's like living in a small town. There's not that many options for dating. You're going to go back to each other. I don't know why I'm fixated on dating this week as my analogies. All right. So as we go down in the pH scale, right? So to go down in the pH scale or to have a lower pH, right, means we are more acidic, or we call it more acidic. And let's take a look at what that means. What does it mean to be acidic? If we take a look at the solutions, right, notice how we are progressively getting more and more higher concentration of H plus ions. Do you guys see that? So now we're in the big city, or bigger and bigger, progressively bigger cities. There's more options, right? Instead of hooking up with an OH, now I'm going to have my hydrogen ions that have a greater propensity of, I'm H plus, and I'm looking to be attracted to something that's got a negative charge out there. It's going to start reacting with anything that it comes across in its environment that happens to have a negative charge. It's not necessarily going to go back to the OH. It can, but it's not necessarily going to, because notice how the OHs are a little bit less abundant. So you've got a lot more reactive H plus ions, and they're going to want to react with anything in the environment that they find that has a slight negative charge or negative charge. Does that make sense? Right. So if we go down, right, we're seeing progressively higher concentrations of H plus ions, which means that solution is getting progressively more reactive with negative things, right? So like battery acid. Bunches, right, of lonely H plus ions in there. They're going to be really reactive to anything they come into contact with. So that battery acid, right, when you spill it on your car paint, it corrodes because all the H plus ions are trying to bond with the paint and disrupting the existing bonds. Breaks it down. Does this make sense? Corrosive acids. Anybody know what's the pH of your stomach?
Isn't it like around 3 or something like that?
Usually around 2, right? Whoa. Super acidic, right? Make sense? Okay. Basic or alkali pH is the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Notice how here, as we go up the scale, what's happening is now instead of having higher proportions of H plus ions, you have higher proportions of OH ions. And those OH ions are going to be equally reactive. Now they're going to be looking to react with anything they find in their environment, but in this case, anything that has a positive charge or a slight positive charge. So they can be equally as reactive, but with different things. Right? So for example, oven cleaner, right? Lots of lonely OH ions, right? Going to be reacting with the grease on your stove. And as it does, it breaks it off of the enamel of your stove. If you put an acid on that grease, it wouldn't remove it as effectively. Does that make sense? Because they're not reacting as much, right? So here we can take a look at, Drano. Look at that, alkali or basic pH, all those OH ions, right? So when you dump this down your drain, the OH ions are binding the hair that's clogged in there and breaking it apart, right? So that you can clear the drain. So pH, right, is looking at the concentrations of OH or H ions in a solution and how reactive it is. Good so far? Okay, so here's the quirky thing about pH, right? We said anything below 7 is acidic. Anything above 7 is alkali or basic. Yeah. Now, each numerical change, each step on the pH scale is a 10-fold difference. So that means that if I went from a pH of 7 to 6, I'm 10 times more acidic, which means I have 10 times more H ions in my solution. If I went from a pH of 7 to a pH of 5, right, 10-fold times a 10-fold, I'm 100 times more acidic. I have 100 times more H ions in my solution. So, what happens if I drop my pH from about neutral in my mouth to 2 in my stomach? There's a lot of zeros. That number of how many times more it is acidic than what was in your mouth. Right? And in your body, you're manipulating pH all the time. Right? You're constantly monitoring pH of your bloodstream. You're changing pH to help protect you against pathogens. Right? So, for example, in your stomach, we said your pH goes from being about neutral, maybe a little bit acidic in your mouth, or maybe more acidic if you're drinking coffee, right? And it drops down to a 2, right? Your stomach lining secreting hydrochloric acid to make an acidic environment. And that is designed to help protect you from any bad bacteria that were on whatever you consumed, kills them off. It also helps to allow those H plus ions to start attacking whatever you've consumed, breaking the molecules between the carbohydrates that you've just eaten in your meal. So it helps you in a process called hydrolysis that we'll talk about later. Does this make sense? Yeah. All right. Okay. So I think oftentimes people don't appreciate when you drop 2 numbers on the pH scale, they're like, no big deal. It's a big deal, especially when it's in the environment, because it can disrupt the chemical reactions that are happening up there. Yeah. But I'll talk about that in a bit. So what your stomach does is drop the pH to 2. But once you've processed that food in your stomach, it's going to enter into your small intestine. That's not adapted for dealing with a pH of 2 the way your stomach is, with mucus and a highly regenerative lining. So your small intestine is going to immediately neutralize pH, right, back up to 7, which I think is impressive, right? So the first part of your small intestine, within the first few inches, you're going to neutralize pH from 2 back up to 7. Whoa! Thank you, pancreas, for helping me with that, but we'll get to digestive system in a bit. That secretion that the pancreas is producing is called a buffer. So a buffer is something that can be added to a solution to stabilize the pH. So it's adding ions for the lonely H plus ions to react with. So things like sodium bicarbonate are buffers. Sodium bicarbonate, like what's in Alka-Seltzer or what your pancreas releases, right, is a buffer. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about pH in our digestive systems, oh, Letitia, I can't eat cucumbers because they're too acidic for my stomach. What do you think? Suspicious, right? A little bit suspicious. And now when we think about the lady testing the pH of the water, right? Oh my God, this water is a pH of 5. Don't give this water to your kids, right? It's acidic. Why would water be a pH of 5? Any ideas?
I have a question. So how about some skin product? They always say like we can help you balance your pH number like that. Does that make sense?
No, but it sure sounds fancy. I'm going to buy it, right? Why would water have a pH of 5 or 6? Any ideas?
Because it has 2 hydrogen, like H2O. I don't know.
Maybe like
Minerals
minerals
have been
inside
added?
the water.
Yeah, it's got things dissolved in it. It's got solutes like minerals and ions, right? Water out of a lake or a creek is probably about a 5.5. Water that comes out of the sky is about a 5.5. To find pure water is pretty hard, right? We purify it chemically or mechanically in order to get pure water. So water is naturally acidic. The big trend now is to drink the alkali water. I was at Whole Foods looking at the water aisle, just stunned, right? Alkalized water, so much healthier for you. It's like $5 for a water that was purportedly a pH of 11. What's going to happen to that water as soon as you drink it? What's going to happen to that pH of 11?
Will it go down?
In less than 3 seconds that it takes to get from your mouth to your stomach, right? Or after, I guess, about 3 seconds. Worth the $5?
No, not at all.
Coincidentally, you know what else has a pH of 11? Glass cleaner. So I'm a little suspect that that alkali water is actually that alkali, but I did want to buy their product and reinforce what they're doing. But one of these days I'm going to buy that water and test it. I might do that I might do that for my ecology class in the spring. That's a great idea. All right, so let me zip this up. I'm going to spend a little less time talking about acid rain just because I want to get to water molecules. Acid rain, you guys heard about acid rain? It's not in the news as much as it used to be, even though it's still an issue. So it's technically called acid deposition, right? But that didn't get people's attention so much, so they changed the name to acid rain, right? And that way people maybe understood or cared a little bit more for about 30 seconds. Acid deposition is any water that's in the air, right? So coming down as rain, right? So water in the liquid form. It could be dew, like in fog. It can be snow. It could be even the vaporized water that's in the air. It's going to be interacting with solutes up in the atmosphere. So there's solutes that are up in the atmosphere that are interacting with the water. And so when the clouds rain that water down, it's going to be a solution. It's not pure water. It's a solution. And normal rain has a pH of about 5.5, right? So slightly acidic. And when it percolates into the ground and the soil, it changes the soil to be slightly acidic, right? So plants are adapted to be in soils that are slightly acidic. Now, the problem with what's happening in our environment is that we're now burning all kinds of fossil fuels and releasing all kinds of chemicals into the atmosphere. And as our concentrations go up, it's like adding more solutes to your Gatorade mix. If you add 5 teaspoons of Gatorade powder instead of 1, right, your overall solution is going to be a lot more concentrated. So the more solutes that we add, natural solutes, into the atmosphere, the more they are contained in the solutions that rain down. So what's happening with acid rain is because of industrialization, right, we're now changing the pH of the rain that's coming down. And so acid rain is anything from a pH of about 4, right, 3 to 4. Right? Remember that that's normal rain is about 5.5. Big deal, it's just 5 to 3. But remember that each jump in the pH scale is a tenfold difference. So now we have rain that's coming down that's, potentially 100 times plus more acidic than what is normal. And when that hits the soil or the aquatic environment, it's now changing the pH of soil. It's now changing the pH of lakes and rivers. And that's problematic because now you have a different chemical environment that can potentially disrupt the chemical reactions that are happening. And indeed, plant roots can no longer exchange ions in the same way with the soil, and plants can die because of it. We're seeing this quite a bit. So here's illustration. This is actually pretty old. It's 1999. I need to get a new pH scale. So what do you think? Why is acid rain more of a problem back east than it is in the west? Any guesses?
What was the question again?
Why is acid rain more of an issue in the east?
Pollution?
Yeah, a lot more pollution, a lot more industrial activities happening back east. And we've also been there a little bit longer and a little bit less trees. So in some places in Europe, it's gotten really dramatic because they've had industrialization for a lot longer, right? And so now we're seeing acid rain that's got pHs that are so acidic that they're damaging buildings that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So just within the last 30 years, we're now starting to see buildings dissolving, right? All throughout the world, right? So if it's dissolving a stone building, you can imagine that it's also going to be interacting with the natural environment. And in Europe, especially, we're starting to see a lot of impacts of the acid rain, changing the soil pH so much that it can kill off entire forests. We're seeing some of the damage of this even here locally in the Sierra Nevadas, right, in our mountain ranges. The pollution from LA is coming, up that corridor, and it, in addition to when it rains down, changes the pH of the soil, it's also interacting when it condenses on the needles of the trees and inhibiting their ability to produce chloroplasts, right? So the plants can't photosynthesize like they once could, and it puts a strain on them until they die, right? Out of drought, and it's all over. This makes sense? Acid rain, huge impacts on life. All right, I'm not going to go into the fish. I'll skip that. Any questions? pH? Feel like you understand pH a little bit better now? Hopefully. So, water. Let me pull up the next PowerPoint. So one of the things I think about, when I'm looking at a product, face lotion, help you to, adjust the pH of your body. Here's my approach. Our bodies have been evolved on the savannah for hundreds of thousands of years, right? If we didn't need it when we were in the savannah, do we need it now? Did humans on the savannah need special fancy lotions? Right. to
No.
maintain the pH, right? How long would you have survived if you needed fancy lotions, right, to help your body maintain pH? So that sometimes, is a great little tool in your toolbox to think about, is this product, do I actually need it, or is this a little bit of hype, right? Okay. So water is fundamental to life, right? Water is so amazing. So hopefully we're going to shift your appreciation for water today. So water, keep in mind, is really abundant on Earth. It covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. We already talked about how it makes up about 70% of the volume of your body. Water, life evolved in water. Right. Water is in our cells, outside of our cells. Every chemical reaction that we have is happening in water, pretty much. Right. So water, incredibly important. So we're going to talk about water's properties and all the ways that it influences life. Right. So for each property of water, I'm going to want you to be able to define it, understand how it works, and I'm going to give you the biological significance of that property of water and some examples. Right? So by the end, you'll have a list of water properties. You'll understand what they are. You'll be able to describe their biological significance and be familiar with the examples that we talked about for each. Does this make sense? Where we're going? Okay, so water's properties are based on its molecular structure. We just talked about this, so I'm going to just review it really quickly, right? Remember, we said the oxygen is more electronegative, right? So it's going to hog the electrons. It's going to create a polar molecule. The fact that water is polar is going to allow it to form hydrogen bonds. And those hydrogen bonds are fundamentally important for driving water's properties. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the polarity of water and the hydrogen bonds that it forms. Are we all crystal clear on understanding why water is a polar molecule? I don't need to, hopefully
Yes.
don't need to recap since we just talked about it. Okay, so when we imagine water out in the environment or in our bodies, you can kind of visualize a little chunk of water molecules like you see here. And remember that those hydrogen bonds are forming, breaking, forming, breaking, forming, breaking, forming, breaking, forming, breaking, right? Individually very weak, so they form and break, form and break, form and break. Right? So here you can see them forming, right? And then in the next moment, they'll be broken and maybe forming in a different location, right? So at any given point of time, there's a bunch of hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, but not all of them. Right? Collectively as a team, they're incredibly strong, which is going to drive the properties of water. While each hydrogen bond is individually weak, because there are so many of them at any given time, collectively they are a strong force. Make sense? Right. So we sometimes describe this property of water molecules forming hydrogen bonds and breaking, forming and breaking, forming and breaking. We call it stickiness, right? Because they kind of stick to each other and break apart, stick and break, stick and break. All right. I think we talked about polarity already. All right. So the first property we're going to talk about is cohesion. All right, so this is the first water property. Cohesion refers to this fact that water molecules will form hydrogen bonds with each other. So in a body of water, water molecules are going to be forming hydrogen bonds with neighboring water molecules. Cohesion. Right? Now, the significance of this, the biological significance, is that when you're looking at a body of water, there's going to be an edge to it, like where the water stops, there's no water molecules above, and it's air. Right? And at that surface, whether it's the surface of a lake or the surface of your glass of water, right, the water molecules at the top are just going to be forming bonds with each other, kind of in 2 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions. Right? So they're going to create a surface, right, a barrier. And that barrier, that surface, is called surface tension. So cohesion is the property It happens because of polarity and the hydrogen bonds forming between neighboring water molecules. The biological significance is that it's going to result in surface tension. And surface tension can be exploited by biological systems for a lot of important processes. So I'm just going to show you a little quick clip. So here's this lizard. That's a terrestrial animal that has figured out how to be able to go underwater. And the way that it does is it has these scales that trap a layer of water around its skin, right? And it can use that cohesion to then trap a bubble of air between the layer of water cohering and making surface tension on its skin and its skin. And it can then utilize it to breathe. Ooh, surface tension. Look at that. Isn't that cool? All right. There's all kinds of ways that critters utilize surface tension. Right? So here's another terrestrial critter. And normally in the lab room, we have a basilisk that you would have been able to see. The basilisk is considered, sometimes called commonly the Jesus lizard, right? Because it's, despite its size, it's able to run across the surface of the water. And the reason it's able to do so is, one, because it's moving so fast. Two, it's using the surface tension, right, to be able to run across. And three, it's got really big feet. Right? So it's able to disperse its weight across a larger area to be able to take advantage of that surface area. It's also got a really light skeleton, but it's kind of the same principle as, have you guys ever worn snowshoes? So you disperse your weight over that big snowshoe so that you don't bust through the surface of the snow. Same principle for walking on water or utilizing surface tension. You distribute your weight over a greater surface. These guys have a really big foot. Right? Or if you take a look at the water strider that's also able to kind of skate across the surface of the water, notice how its foot, right, is pretty big relative to its body, so it can disperse its weight. Yes? So a long time ago, I used to, let students write a couple of things that they learned that weren't on the exam. So, that you feel justified where you have that experience where I studied that and it wasn't on the exam. I'm like, okay, tell me, right? And I had this student tell me one time on there, it was probably my favorite one. Jesus had big feet, and that's how he was able to walk on water. And I thought, well, that's not what I said, but I like the biological principle in there. So I'm going to give partial points for that. So surface tension can be used by critters to live on the surface of any aqueous environment. And indeed, if you look at a lake, if you look at a creek, if you look at the ocean, right, there's a whole microscopic, very, very small ecosystem that lives just on the surface of water, right, taking advantage of surface tension. We also take advantage of surface tension in our body, right? On the surface of your eye, you have this layer of water that's cohered and making that boundary to prevent pathogens or dust to get onto the delicate surface of your eye. Right? We'll also talk about surface tension later on when we talk about our lungs, right? It's very important for how we breathe. Make sense? Okay, so in terms of application, cohesion and surface tension are happening because hydrogen bonds are forming between neighboring water molecules, right? Sometimes you can have other polar molecules that come in and form those hydrogen bonds with the water molecules. And that's going to disrupt, right, the water's cohesion properties, right? This is something that we call a surfactant, right? So a surfactant is another charged or polar molecule that's going to come in and disrupt the existing hydrogen bonds between water molecules, right? So that they don't form that surface tension, right? You break the surface tension. That makes sense? No hydrogen bonds between water molecules at the surface means no surface tension. Surfactants we use quite a bit in our body to inhibit surface tension. So for example, we secrete surfactants in our lungs to keep the small air sacs from adhering to each other and collapsing our lungs. But again, I'll talk about that in more detail later on. Surfactants we also use in everyday life, right? We take advantage of them for breaking the surface tension on the, chunky food that's stuck to our dishes, right? And by doing so, your detergent is now more able to attack the actual debris that's on your plate or in your laundry, right? So soaps are examples of surfactants. They break surface tension. This is why you're not supposed to use regular dish soap in the creek when you're camping, right? It's why you're not supposed to wash your car with regular soap on the street, right? Because that ends up draining back into the bay, and the surfactants that you introduce break the surface tension and you destroy the ecosystem that's at the surface of the water. Make sense? Surfactants? All right. Adhesion. So water molecules, as we just talked about with the surfactant, can form hydrogen bonds with other polar or other charged molecules. When they do so, this is called adhesion. Right? So here's the same image we saw earlier with a hydrogen bond forming between water molecules and an ammonia molecule. Right? They're both polar. They're going to form a hydrogen bond to each other. So when water forms a hydrogen bond with another type of molecule that's not water, we call it adhesion. Cohesion is forming a hydrogen bond between two water molecules. Adhesion is between water and something else. So they're slightly different. Does that make sense? All right. So when water is in a space, it's going to form cohesion with other neighboring water molecules. But if it's in, like, say, a little tube or a vessel, right, it's also going to potentially adhere to the edges of the boundary, right, that it's experiencing. So if you've taken fancy chemistry, you've learned you always measure your water level at the meniscus, at the bottom, at the low point, right? Because water adheres to the container and kind of creeps up at the edges, kind of shimmies up. Yeah, you guys notice this? You probably see it in a glass of water as well. It just might not be as dramatic. Yeah. So this is a combination of cohesion and adhesion. And this is going to be super important for driving something we call capillary action. So water in a small space especially, right, as it adheres, right, to the edges of the surface that it's encountering, is going to creep up. Right? And you can draw and move water now just by its natural properties of cohering and adhering to other molecules in its environment. You don't have to use energy to move water up a small space or through a small tube. Capillary action. So capillary action is a combination of cohesion and adhesion working together. And capillary action is really important in biological systems. So here locally, we're fortunate to be living amongst the coast redwoods, tallest trees in the world, right? Sometimes over 200 feet tall, right? How does that tree move water from its roots all the way up to its canopy, right? That would be really expensive if it had to use ATP energy to pump water that distance. That tree would not be able to survive. The reason why they can grow big is because inside the tree, from the roots to the leaves, there's all these tiny, tiny, tiny little tubes, right? And as water moves into a root system, it coheres and adheres in those little tubes and naturally creeps up. Right? Capillary action allows a tree to move water up its length. Any plant moves water up its length using capillary action. So it can now pump water without having to use energy. It's just minimized its cost so it can survive more readily. Does this make sense?
Yes.
When you don't have water moving into a tree, like you forget, or your plant, you forget to water it, the hydrogen bonds between neighboring water molecules breaks. And then your plant can't transport water anymore. It wilts. But we'll talk about that later. Good so far? We talked about cohesion, adhesion, right? 2 properties so far. Now, before I move on and finish the rest of the properties, I want to take a little sidebar, right? The next 2 properties of water are associated with heat, right? So I want to first define heat so that we all understand what it means, right? So heat is the amount of energy associated with the movements of atoms and molecules in any matter, right? So it turns out that atoms, right, are moving around in the environment, right? And remember that when we have motion, we have kinetic energy, right? So they're releasing energy. So when they're moving, they're releasing energy, right? We call that heat, that energy that they're releasing. The faster that they're moving, right, the more energy they're releasing. The heat goes up, or their temperature goes up, right? Temperature is just the measure of how much heat's being produced. What do you think happens when you put something in the freezer? What happens to the atoms? They slow down in their moving, right? And don't release as much heat energy. Conversely, if we stuck a cold steak in a microwave, zap, zap the buttons, you're using, electricity to microwave that cold steak. Those microwaves, right, move through the steak tissue and agitate, right, bump into and agitate the atoms, right? And as they get agitated, they start moving around, and guess what? They've heated up. Yeah? So how much motion, right, you have is really important for how much heat you're generating. Good? Okay, I'll come back to this definition later. So 2 properties that we're going to talk about: high specific heat and high heat of vaporization. These, I think, are the 2 hardest properties to keep track of because their differences are subtle. So both are going to be ways that we use water to moderate temperature, right? Or to regulate temperature. So first one I'm going to talk about is high specific heat, right? So remember that in a body of water, right, you have all these water molecules and they're forming hydrogen bonds between each other. I always imagine that hydrogen bonds between water molecules are like holding hands, right? And notice how some of these water molecules are holding hands with 4 other people. Oh, tricky. So pretty stable in their position. Right? So if you're holding hands or forming hydrogen bonds between water molecules, it's going to inhibit them from getting agitated. My example for you is, you guys know what a mosh pit is? How well can you mosh, bounce around and move if everybody's holding hands? It's going to stabilize your position, holding hands with other people, and inhibit you from moshing, right, or moving. So water in a body of water, in a lake, in a glass, right, they're forming hydrogen bonds, and that's going to stabilize their position so that they resist moving. And if they resist moving, they resist heating. Yeah? Okay. So you already know this property, turns out. It's what helps water moderate temperature in the environment and in your body, because all the water molecules, 70% of your body, that are forming hydrogen bonds are stable. It's going to make it hard for your body to heat up. Or it's going to resist heating, I should say. Same thing with the environment. Water moderates temperature. So last weekend that it was broiling heat? On a hot day, where would you rather be? At the beach or at West Valley campus? Oh, there's a confounding factor in that. at the beach. Why? What's the temperature going to be like at the beach compared to West Valley?
Be cool.
Cooler.
It's going to be a lot cooler. Why? Because when that solar radiation,
Like the coast area.
water's absorbing it and resisting heating, it moderates the temperature. Right by the lake is always going to be cooler than inland, right by the ocean. Right? So water's moderating temperature in the environment. Water right now is what's saving us from climate change, but only so much heat that the water can absorb. And that's a conversation for another day where I want to be a little bit more scary than I want to be today. All right, good with high specific heat? All right. So the next, I hear you being naughty in there. He goes in the back room behind the crate when he's being naughty. It's like his special spot for hiding out of my line of view. All right. High heat of vaporization is also going to help us in regulating temperature in a body, right? So it turns out, right, that we can use energy to break the hydrogen bonds between water molecules. And that's expensive because in liquid water that you're seeing here, there's tons of hydrogen bonds. So to break them all and turn water from a liquid, break all the hydrogen bonds so that they separate away from each other into a gas, to steam, that requires a lot of energy. Vaporizing water from a liquid to a steam takes a lot of energy to break all those hydrogen bonds. So if you've generated excess heat energy, like say you were working out, you're contracting your muscles, and every time you cycle ATP, you release energy as heat as a byproduct of that reaction. And when you're exercising, you're cycling way more ATP, you're releasing more heat. So normally that heat, we use it to keep our bodies warm. But when we're cycling extra ATP because we're contracting our muscles more, we're generating extra heat. And we don't want our bodies to overheat. We need to get rid of that heat energy. How do we get rid of it? What happens when you work out? What do?
You sweat.
You sweat, right? So that you can use that extra heat energy and waste it, dump it, by using it to break hydrogen bonds in water and vaporizing it. That process is energetically expensive. So if you have extra heat energy to dump, you can waste it or dump it, get rid of it by using it to break hydrogen bonds. We call this evaporative cooling. That's the biological significance of high heat of vaporization. High heat of vaporization means it takes a lot of energy to break the hydrogen bonds in liquid water and convert it into gas water. Yeah, so if you have extra energy, you can use that as a way of spending down that energy. All right, so we do that when we sweat. We actively release water onto the surface of our body and then vaporize it so that we can cool our bodies down. Other organisms do it a little bit differently, right? Like this is my last bloodhound. He was equally as naughty, maybe even more naughty than Virgil is, actually, if I'm honest. Panting. Dog or cat, right, is vaporizing water off of its tongue, right, to be able to cool down. Birds will do this also on a hot day. You'll see them with their bills gaping, right, as a way to vaporize water off of their respiratory system and mouth. Make sense? Evaporative cooling? Ooh, I might just be able to finish this up. Okay. Let's talk about density. Right. So water has super unique density properties, right? It's going to increase in density as its temperature decreases. Right? So water, as it gets colder, gets more and more dense. You know this already from your everyday experience. So For example, how many of you guys have ever had this experience in the spring where you're like, ooh, winter's finally getting close to being over. I'm so excited to hang out at the swimming pool. Every day you're dipping your toe in. Ooh, it's still too cold. Ooh, it's still too cold. And then that day comes when, ooh, that's not bad. I could do that. Right? And you jump into the pool, and what happens? It's not the temperature that it was at the top, right? Down deep is really cold, right? You usually only have that experience once, then you learn. But my point here is that the cold water sinks to the bottom because it's more dense, right? It's heavier, denser. I don't know if I can use this interchangeably, actually, right? So cold water is going to be more dense. It's going to drop down. Biologically, environmentally, this is going to be super, super important, right? But I'll get to that in a bit. So it's going to get more and more and more and more and more dense, right? Until it hits 4 degrees Celsius. And at 4 degrees Celsius, that temperature is going to promote the formation of hydrogen bonds. This is when water will form maximal number of hydrogen bonds. And if we take a look, right, here's liquid water. Notice how the hydrogen bonds are forming and breaking, right? So it's like you're holding hands, but then you break one of those hydrogen bonds and you can kind of slip closer to your neighbor, right? And then, so your hydrogen bonds are breaking and you can scoot in a little bit closer, getting denser, 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 until you hit 4 degrees C. And then all of a sudden your maximal formation of hydrogen bonds. And look at what happens when you form maximal hydrogen bonds. It separates the water molecules all out in 3-dimensional space. They form this lattice formation. They get less dense. Right? But you know this, right? Because you know that ice cubes float in your beverage. Because sea ice floats, right, in the ocean. Make sense? Solid water ice is less dense. Most things on Earth, when they go from a liquid to a solid, get more dense. Ooh, water's the opposite. Super unique. It gets less dense as a solid. Good? Hydrogen bonds at the root of everything. So cool. All right, so the changing in density of water, let me wrap this up. I'm just not going to get to the slides. I don't understand what it is about Zoom that I speak slower or take more time. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not getting, my pacing is totally off on Zoom. But let me finish this up and then I'll talk about solutes because I think I'm out of time. So as the density of water changes in biological systems, this is really important, right? Because it allows water to move up and down the water column, right? And for now, we'll just talk about how it displaces the nutrients that get trapped at the bottom, right? Same thing in the oceans, right? For us in California, we have water coming from the north, right? Really, really cold. So it moves, that current moves down deep along the ocean's floor and sweeps up the organic nutrients that's trapped there and brings it to the surface where there's sunlight for photosynthesis to be able to support life. You know? So this, I don't have time to, kind of expand upon, but it's really, really, really important, right? For supporting life in aquatic systems, whether it's a lake or an ocean, right? This property that water's moving up and down as it changes density with changing temperature, right? So does that make sense on a superficial level?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I didn't have time to talk about solvents. This really drives me nuts to not finish a whole concept. Okay. I guess I will stop there.